John Hopkins is a filmmaker from Prince Edward Island, Canada's smallest province. Lying in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, PEI is famous for bluefin tuna, which travel north every summer from their breeding grounds in the Caribbean to feed on vast schools of mackerel, capelin, and herring. Recently, though, those species have been diminishing, and the tuna, which are normally shy and wary, seem to have lost their fear of fishermen and appear to be starving. Like such other celebrated documentaries as Blackfish, The Cove, and the late Rob Stewart's Sharkwater, John Hopkins' Bluefin is a meditation on the ignorance, greed, and carelessness with which we treat the ocean. It asks why our social and political relationships as humans have made us incapable of managing a sustainable harmony with ocean wildlife, and what we can do about that.
Canada has a great tradition of documentary filmmaking, especially for the National Film Board, which is how I made this film. And because of that, I was able to spend more time with my subjects in terms of the bluefin tuna fishing and ocean issues off of Prince Edward Island, and wildlife issues and what's going on with the fishery. And as a result, I finished my film, and I've been out on the festival circuit with it. And anyway, yesterday, Peter Bevan Baker, who's the head of the Green Party in Prince Edward Island, actually presented how well the film has done on the international circuit, and the fact that it's really pointing out some really important things that we need to start paying attention to, which really we've been asleep on in terms of, like, everybody sort of pays attention to land issues, but we're surrounded by ocean here in the land of Canada, and it's really not something that is explored often enough. So in Prince Edward Island, with the herring situation, it was basically this year the stocks are pretty much collapsed. They didn't catch their tuna quota this year, which is kind of what my film was warning against the whole time. And it sort of goes back, you know, to the issue of saving the herring stock, because at one point in 2004, in Surrey, I don't know if people will remember, but they actually had a large riot there with like just about every fisherman on the island and the RCMP riot squad, and it was quite an intense situation. People, there was one RCMP got ran over by an 18-wheeler. I mean, they had attack dogs, machine guns, you know, full riot gear, and basically at that point what they were doing was trying to stop the Gulf seiners from offloading herring, which a seiner is like a giant sort of net, which they can surround an entire school of fish. You ever see cold water cowboys? It's like a, you know, like it's on Discovery Channel. Anyway, that's the kind of fishing it is. And then they were trying to offload it in Surrey, which is on the south shore. It's like a big port in the south shore of Prince Edward Island. And then they would take it across the island, across the bridge, and they would process it in New Brunswick somewhere, you know, probably through a herring row, you know, which they're selling to the Japanese. So the fishermen realized, you know, if the herring seiners came in close to the shore, that they would scoop out pretty much everything very quickly. So they figured, well, you know, we have to stop this. So they made this great big stand, which they were successful. And they were able to drive them off out to sea. They can't come in closer than 20 fathoms, like in close to Prince Edward Island. So, you know, in a way, they protected the resource. And at that time, they said, well, we need that resource because herring is the, you know, it's the bottom of the food chain. I mean, which all the larger predators in terms of whales and seals and seabirds and tuna, they all have to eat this, you know. It's like the breadbasket, and basically it's all we got left because we've already got rid of most of our ground fishing stocks, like cod we've lost already, and you know, silver hake. Basically all we got left is like tuna and lobster and a bit of herring, a little bit of snow crab, and that's it. Everything else has been fished out. Anyway, so it's supposed to be a conservation measure, but that was back in 2004, which is pretty much at the time when the large tuna started trickling back into the North Lake area and the Gulf area. And some of the fishermen are saying, well, the fish came back into this area after disappearing for 10 years from overfishing because they didn't have a food source south of Atlantic Canada, like along the eastern seaboard United States. A lot of those fish had been, the herring had been fished out. There's only like one herring plant left in New England, basically. So the fish moved north. So this is the theory anyways, that they created a sanctuary which attracted the tuna. So all of a sudden, the tuna started coming back in really large numbers. And, you know, it was game on, you know. All of a sudden, North Lake, which was the tuna capital of the world way back when in the 60s and 70s and 80s, you know, got a second chance. I mean, the tuna were overfished, and all of a sudden the tuna came back, and part of it they believe was with the herring. But basically what's happened since then is that, you know, instead of, it's sort of like the 200-mile limit, you know, where they said we needed it to keep off, you know, the large sort of factory freezer trawlers off of Newfoundland. And what happened there is what was supposed to be a conservation measure, and then it became a free-for-all for, you know, basically National Sea, you know, Sobeys, and only 20% of that cod fishery was actually, or 30% I think, was the foreign overfishing, which they blamed it on after the cod collapsed. So, you know, it's sort of the same sort of thing. They in Prince Edward Island, they created a sanctuary, but it became exactly the same thing that happened with the 200-mile limit, happened with the herring. And basically, the herring got exhausted quite quickly, because as I discovered in making my film, that the herring is actually the primary source of lobster bait for their traps. And they pretty much exhausted like everything else. That's all that's left pretty much to bait their traps. And the lobster fishery is by far the most lucrative fishery in the economy over there. So say 2012 is the last figures I studied actually, but around there was around $120 million a year in terms of what the fishery was taken back in lobster directly, right? And the tuna fishery would be $3 million, so basically less than 1% of their income is from tuna fishery, from the tuna fishing. So they really don't need to catch these fish at all. And from the best science that we have, they're saying that the stocks are anywhere down from, you know, 90 to 80%. They're making a comeback now. So so they have a situation here where they conserved the herring, but in the 5 years that I was making my film, when I was off North Lake, there would be like 7 kilometers of herring boats, and they were taking, they're called gill nets. You know, it's kind of like a funnel thing, and in the fourth year, third year, it's gradually got smaller and smaller. So it went from 7 kilometers to like 5 to 3. Last year I was out there filming, it was like 1. Basically, it had all gone, and they're fishing the herring while they're spawning, which is not allowing them to reproduce. So, you know, basically they could see that there was a problem coming, and but people just couldn't stop fishing them. It's sort of like, well, they're a migratory fish like tuna. So if the tuna or we don't catch them like someone else will, so they just kept on fishing them. So yeah, we got to the point now where the stock has pretty much collapsed off of North Lake and off of Fisherman's Bank, which is a large undersea plateau between Cape Breton and Surrey. There used to be, at the height of it, in the last 40 years, 250 herring boats fishing off of Fisherman's Bank. These days, you'd be lucky to see 2 or 3 boats, and which is unfortunate, because not only the fishermen's livelihood for the future is compromised, but it also is very, very important for all the sea life that's out there. The whales, the seabirds, the tuna, all these different species depend on a good herring stock. So
if you don't have that, I guess one of the things that puzzled me about the situation, basically you had fished out the tuna in Prince Edward Island, 12, 14 years ago. 10-year pause, no tuna, and then they come back, and big fish, and in large numbers, come back for the herring. But if the herring is gone now, are the tuna gone too?
Yeah, there's not a food source, they're gone. Yeah, basically they'll disappear, and that's what basically this year was much harder to catch tuna over there, because they scattered, because the herring boats aren't catching anything. So the tuna were coming around the herring boats, because when you're pulling up the herring net, you know, like there would be like small herring like fall off of it. Do you know what I mean? So that's why they're sort of in close, and it actually helped the charter fishing. The sports fishing was easy because you basically hang out near the herring boats, which was the food source, and you know, hook a tuna and then try to keep them from like getting tangled up in the nets, you know, type of thing. So yeah, made for pretty much you know, you go out and you could hook up in a tuna for like in 2 minutes, and the fish became so desperate in terms of the hunger. You know, you could hand feed the fish right over the side of the boat. And tuna have always been a very wary fish. They've always been very scared of humans. Like you'd be fishing in the old days when the stocks are great, you'd be fishing for 30 days and not even see a tuna, you know, and people would come and charter a boat for 30 days. These days, if you don't catch like, you know, 3 to 5 tuna in a week, then people don't want to come back, you know. It's, you're obviously not a good captain, you know. But basically, you know, you can, it's at the point now where the tuna, you know, they're not a stupid animal. They're a smart animal. And they realize that the boats are actually a food source.
Somebody was telling me that the fish are now out here are so tame now that they're actually throwing some herring right from the boat, and the fishing are coming right up and getting them. They were always the opposite to, as far as I was concerned. They were always shy, and
yes,
they couldn't.
extremely.
They're hungry. They want to be fed. We hand feed them from our herring. When we shuck the herring nets out, they're coming for food. It's like any stray dog comes to your door and he comes looking, you give him that first bite. What's going to be there the next morning? He's going to be back again soon as he hear the doorknob and you overlook step out and he's ain't going to be too far away. He's going to look for another biscuit or some slice of bread or something, and that tuna's looking for easy meals. That's what they want.
Well, that's what was striking me as you were talking, was to say if there were lots of tuna around, they wouldn't come close to the boats. The fact that the boats are there, that they see the boats as, that they see the leftovers from the boats as being their best source of food is pretty tragic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, you know, pretty much. I mean, the stocks have gotten nailed that much. I mean, these fish are voracious. I mean, they're like anywhere from like 600 to 1,300 pounds. I mean, they need a lot of food. They're constantly swimming. They have a high metabolism. And the same with whales, you know, and seals and all these animals. You know, part of the problem has been the science is part of the problem as well. You know, because only in the last couple of years have they decided that actually when they're doing like a stock assessment in terms of what quotas in ICAT, or, you know, in terms of what the scientists are doing, they are actually figuring out a management scheme based on not just a single species, which would be tuna. Before they were just saying, okay, we're just going to focus on that. Now they're looking at the size of the herring stock, because they're interrelated. See, and then the problem is that if you made a quota for the herring stock, you would make it just in terms of what you thought you could take as a human being, but they were making no calculations whatsoever for whales or tuna or seabirds or anything, and the stock just kept on going down because you know, they didn't leave off a chunk for wildlife. You know, it's kind of like we have this kind of, you know, narcissistic view of ourselves as you know, what we need, and it's always about what we need. It's not about what the planet needs.
Yeah, and so if I've got this right, then, and I think you're right, the whole phrase "managed," that word is in this kind of context is a pretty silly word, right?
Well, I mean, it's kind of crazy right now because, yeah, I mean, they were fishing the herring for bait, and the rest of it they were selling off the roe for sushi. I mean, it got to the point where basically the stocks pretty much collapsed. I mean, and over the last number of years, you know, it's been so easy to catch tuna because they've been really starving and hungry. That the model that DFO uses is just called catch effort model. And it's basically, you know, they have kind of an algorithm, or what, you know, in terms of a way of figuring out what the stock is based on what fishermen would report, you know, over a whole season, where they caught the fish, where it was, how much it is. They have monitors on the wharves and stuff like that.
And a fisherman would never lie about that, of course.
Well, they do actually, because they're kind of don't want anyone to know where their fishing hole is, you know. So that the data does have a bit of like uncertainty in that respect. But basically, the fish are so easy to catch that DFO's records are off the charts. They've never seen numbers like this, and they're like really
herring or tuna.
Tuna, in terms of catch effort, like the catch effort. I mean, when I started making this film, which is way back in 2010, they actually had what they call a free-for-all with the tuna quota. So the tuna quota would be like 505 metric tons, I think, at that time. And so rather than staggering the fishing over a season, they just said, well, you just go out and try to get as many fish as you can, as fast as you can. Some fishermen loved it because they figured they were better fishermen than others. They can get 3 or 4, so most of the fishermen actually prefer a free-for-all. But they went out and they caught the entire quota, 505 metric tons, I believe, somewhere close to that, at that time, in 48 hours flat. And then that roughly figures out to, 450 fish, averaging 735 pounds of fish. I mean, they always say, well, it's the seniors, it's the big boats that are the problem. They can take a whole school in, one. It's true, they can do that, but when you have 360 boats, that's a powerful fishing force. And then when you look at these fish, are the largest breeders. I mean, they're the largest tuna in the Western Atlantic, the only breeding stock that's actually left in the Atlantic. These fish are really important because they actually hold the key to repopulating all the stocks that have basically disappeared, that left the fish in a highly depleted state. So if you kill one tuna, say, yeah, I only killed one tuna, but if you had let that tuna reproduce, like, how many fish did you actually kill? And that's not even in anyone's mind in terms of quota, or in terms of conserving. Basically, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think education's necessary. And I'm glad that my film is sort of getting people to talk about this stuff. But a lot of fishermen actually believe that catching the large fish is the best thing to do, because they've already spawned. They consider them like old people, and they've already reproduced, and you got to save the smaller fish because that's the future. Whereas the scientists I've spoken with, like Jeff Hutchings, for example, over in Dalhousie, he said, no, actually, that's not right at all. He said, like, if you look what happened, why the cod collapsed, is because they took all the mature year classes of fish and wiped them out of the population. So basically, cod would be anywhere from 6 or 7 years old to 12 years old. That would be the spawning stock, and they wiped it all back to about 5, and that caused the whole stock to collapse. So in a way, by taking these large fish, which are have the most genetically robust eggs, and they're actually can exponentially lay more eggs than a fish half of its size, it's a lot. It has a lot more impact than people had estimated.
Let me pause on that point, because I think I remember this from the film. It was Jeff Hutchings, I think, that made that point, that if you double the size of the fish, you way more than double the amount of production as far as eggs is concerned, right? And
yeah, that's exactly it. It's actually, it was Boris Worm that made that point. It's certainly interesting. Yeah, taking the large ones out of the population is probably like the last thing you should be doing. And then part of the things that Peter Bevan Baker actually recommended in the legislature yesterday is maybe they should have a size limit, in terms of, like, we take the large salmon, wild salmon, we're not allowed to keep the egg layers like we're out fly fishing. We put those back. Why do we put those back? You know what I mean? Why do we? I mean, the way it is in the tuna fisheries, we keep all those and put the little ones back. It doesn't make any sense. And I think there's part of it's like I think there needs to be for things to change. I think the fishermen are really in control of their own future if they really want that. Because I think the only way anything's ever going to change is that they're the ones that are going to have to ask for the change and rally together. But I think there needs to be a greater dialogue between scientists and fishermen. It's not like us and they, like, oh, the scientists, they're the sort of the serons, they're the Mordor people, and we're just like the folk that try to, make a living.
Well, yeah.
So it's sort of like, that's us and them. And what I wanted to do with my film was bring us and them together. So I actually brought the scientists out to North Lake because the fishermen were saying, well, we're the scientists of the sea. We know what's going on here. We know when the fish are in, when they should be behind the tuna. We know the cycles and the seasons. And it's true, they have this really incredible knowledge gathered from, years and decades out in the water. So they actually have a lot of really valuable information that scientists can use. But I mean, that's part of the issue here. I think, that one of the reasons I made the film was to try to get that kind of communication going, because I just think everything's so compartmentalized. And then you've got DFO as well, which is another, they're supposed to be managing the stock. But I think from everything I've seen, that it's been a complete disaster the way that they've been doing it. Because, people, fishermen are out there seeing so many tuna out there going like, well, all the stocks are rebuilt. And what the scientists I talked to said, no, actually, these are all the tuna that's left aggregated all into Atlantic Canada for a number of reasons. Lack of food down south in terms of herring. Global warming has allowed a lot more large pelagic fish to move north because the temperature has dropped, or a fish that was 300 to 400 pounds would normally not be in these waters are coming into these waters now and joining the larger fish. And lately, there was a recent study, it was just released, that said actually part of the big abundance thing that we're seeing in Atlantic Canada is because 59% of the fish that we're seeing here is actually of European origin. They're actually European tuna that are here. And so this was just discovered just recently. So there's a lot of uncertainty. See, the stocks are mixing. So here you got the catch effort models could put. It doesn't apply anymore. You cannot do a stock assessment because the fish are so hungry and easy to catch. That way of doing a stock assessment is blown, kaput. And DFO knows it. But they're taking that data and going to ICAD and say, hey, look at the data. The catch effort's great. The stocks are fantastic. Give us more quota. And they got it in 2014. And I think a lot of scientists over there are kind of suspicious in terms of the data. This year they got more quota again on top of where they got it in 2014. And which is absolutely insane, because the thing is that the uncertainty of the science is just chaotic. No catch effort data is gone. You got mixing of the two different tuna stocks, so you don't know how many Atlantic tuna is mixed up in there in terms of making an assessment and providing a quota. So there's absolutely no rational sanity right now in terms of making any kind of quota decision. What we really need, there's something really phenomenal going on in the oceans right now. There's big changes with global warming, with fish patterns, migration patterns. You're seeing it with right whales. They're looking for food too, and they've changed their patterns, and now they're swimming out into the middle of shipping lanes and getting run over. We just lost 17 of them. I mean, there should be some major red flags going on here, and basically, my film's been really great in that way because it's really kind of opened up a window onto the stuff that just wasn't there before, and it's wonderful to be able to talk to audiences and talk to people, because people really want to know. But I mean, it was like me when I first started. I didn't have a clue about any of this stuff. I mean, I just thought, tuna, it's like you get it in a can. I used to watch the Flintstones and mix it with mayonnaise and, eat a tuna sandwich at lunchtime. And I mean, I thought, well, it's just a normal part of life. Tuna, the word tuna triggers, it's a food mechanism, right? But the albacore and skipjack is what you find in a tuna can. So in a way, we are being socialized to think of tuna as food. We're wired to think them as food, not as wildlife. So every time you go to the grocery stores, it's actually really bad for bluefin tuna, because we're not seeing them as a creature in the same kind of sense we would appreciate an elephant or a rhinoceros or a lion or tiger or a whale or a dolphin. because we don't see them as something we need to save. We see them as something we need to eat. But actually, they're as epic and as important as any, land mammal. But I think the difference is that they have gills. They're slightly alienated in terms of we want to, as a species, as humans, we want to save animals that have lungs. And then you think about further how we're socialized, and this is like, tuna have got a bad rap. I mean, we've had docs on on sharks and whales and different things, but they've been off the radar. So you look at it, okay, when we were growing up as kids, okay, so we got a lot of stuffed toys, we got like these stuffed animals, giraffes, panda bears, monkeys, and then we sort of bonded with them. And I know this sounds simple, but I think there's some truth to it. And then when we got older, we left those things, they sold them off, but then we started getting the Lion King, and we got the Jungle Book, and we got Nemo, finding, the Nemo, and they got all these different characters that have been created for us by the sort of like the Dream Machine and Disney and stuff, but there was never a stuffed tuna. Like tuna was never something that people saw as wildlife that's special in that sense. So, it's sort of, in terms of the way that we can empathize with wildlife, the way that we do it, in terms of the way we're socialized, I think that's been part of the problem with tuna.
It's the history of North Lake. It's the adrenaline rush catching these big fish. And we're fishermen. What's any better than a big fish?
People knew that, there was 1,000-pound giants here, and a lot of them want to chase these giants because they want to join a club, the 1,000-pound club it's called. That's how it all started. That's how the place got found, how the tuna capital of the world became.
I think Carl Safina that makes that point in the film, and that we don't see fish as wildlife generally. Any fish, and certainly not tuna. But he's curious to know more about them, and to know more about sort of who they are and how they live and what they see, and he talks as though they're quite conscious. He talks about them as though.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it's sort of like when people say, well, why do you care about tuna? They're just a fish. Fish are stupid. Why do you care? To kill they don't have a soul. There's no spirit, I mean, we don't know anything about them. That's the truth is. I mean, they live under the water. They're not easily, you can't see them easily. They're not accessible. When we dive down the road, we see some deer or a bear or something, we go, there's a bear there. Like you kind of know that they're there, but these are, in a way, they kind of suffer from being out of sight in that sense. But when we were diving with
these guys are warm-blooded too. They're you think a fish is cold-blooded, but these guys are
they're warm-blooded shore sharks. But the reason they're warm-blooded, they're actually 20 degrees higher than the seawater temperature, and they do that so they can forage further north in colder waters. So they're super fish. I mean, they can swim across the ocean in 2 weeks. They can dive down 3,000 feet. The only other animal can do that is like a sperm whale going after like giant squid. They can do like a sprint at 55 miles an hour under the water and outswim torpedoes. I mean, they've tagged them and found them 25,000 miles away. I mean, they're an extraordinary creature, and we really don't know anything about them in that sense. But in terms of, them having a brain, like I was going to say, like Boris Worm was out with us, and Brian Scarry, who's a famous National Geographic photographer. We went out and brought the scientists out to see the fishermen. We went and dived in with the giant tuna, 800,000-pound tuna. And Boris Worm was saying, like they took like a little bag of herring down there. It's just like, those shark fishing experience tours, and they would like throw a little herring out, and, tuna would come right up and just like take it, turn on a dime and take off. But Boris was saying actually one of them was sort of like hanging out and was kind of like a husky, and it was kind of, and they went he went 800 yards out into the water, and this thing just hung out and it was waiting for one, just like a pet would, you know what I mean? Give me another one, give me another one. You know what I mean? And so there was that kind, they sort of had the, personality of a husky. They kind of didn't really care about you, but wanted the food, but would hang out until they got what they wanted, and then they didn't care. It's kind of like the personality that they had. So it was extraordinary to see them.
I would like to just be able to go out and catch and kill these fish like I did when I was 12 years old or 20 years old or 30 years old. and feel okay about it because I thought there were lots and lots of fish. But that's just not the situation that we have. Oh, there's one right there. Boy, oh my God! Wow! Oh my! Wow! I've seen a lot of tuna, but that's the biggest one I've ever seen at the surface. Oh, geez. Now these fish were missing here for many years. Now they're back. People are guessing about why exactly they've come back here. They may in a few years be gone again. Oh.
This is the other thing, you know, necessarily you can actually do tours, you know, where people could, ecological tours, where people could actually dive with the tuna. There's been no development of that, no money invested. I mean, all over the world you have people jumping in with sharks that can bite you. Tuna won't bite you, but they're just as magnificent and just as thrilling. Like when you're under the water holding like a little herring, you know, it's kind of pea green water, so you can't see all that well, maybe 30, 35 feet. You know, you got an 800 and 1,000 pound fish that just comes like boom right up to you right here, you know, with 100-inch girth, turns, takes the thing, and you're like in outer space. It's like pushing the water column towards you. You know, like if you're not like thrilled beyond every pore you've ever felt and your body burst at that point, you know, it's just like that's an experience that people will pay for. I mean, you hold one here in front of you, and you're looking for the next tuna, and he's coming straight up from the bottom. And all of a sudden, I mean, it makes your heart jump out of your mask, you know.
And you've got spectacular footage of that kind.
That's amazing. I mean, that's a part of the thing is that like people really don't know what these fish are. I mean, it's just food. You go to the plate, you see it on a plate, it looks pretty in sushi, and it's all elegant and noble when you go into the sushi restaurant. But you know what? You might as well be eating an elephant. You know, you might as well eat a panda bear because it's about the same equivalent in terms of the ocean, you know, and...
well, this is sort of the apex fish in every ocean, isn't it?
It is. It's one of them. Yeah, the sharks are the other one. They're basically top predator, you know. We're the top predator. But the thing is that the way that the ocean works, there is a food chain. You know, there's like the phytoplankton, and, you know, creates like little animals and little fish, and then herring eat those, and you know it sort of goes up the food chain, right? And everything works in balance. You know, there's a balance there, and it's necessary. Like the predators are there, and you know and the whole thing kind of works. But human beings come along, and we're not part of the food chain. That's the problem. We go over, you know, these fleets of seiners, gill netters. We have like technologies that's, you know, gone through the roof over the last 100 years, and the fish really don't stand a chance. We can chase them down, we can find them, we got satellites. I mean, there's just so much, it's hard to hide anymore, you know, and that's part of the problem is that the technology is gone, and it's not really, no one's really thinking about that. Oh, well, that's really great. No, well, no, maybe the technology isn't great in terms of, you know, the overall system that needs to work. And so what we need to do as human beings is find ways where we actually work with that food chain so there's harmony and balance. Because the thing is that, you know, that source of protein from the oceans is like super important in terms of feeding people. You know, if we wipe them out in terms of like take so many that the fish become extinct, and a number of species that's happened to, and the cod's like a good example, you know, that food protein is gone. I mean, you can't feed the future, can't feed people. I mean, when you look at what's happening on the land, we pretty much have gone to maximum production in terms of agribusiness. You can't really squeeze too much out of an acre anymore to feed the world, and then we got the populations exploding. So there's only so much food, you know, and then we got like an XY axis in the future where we get to a point where there's just not enough food for the amount of people it is, and where are we going to get the food? Well, the most logical place would be the ocean. You know, I think the oceans, it would be the sort of key to feeding future populations, but if we annihilate the fish until they're genetically disappeared, you know, you'd have to have another planet star explosion another billion years to get it back again. I mean, it's so precarious what we're doing because you know, it's so important. Maybe we'd go and we just don't pay attention to it, but actually, in terms of, I think I think the oceans are the future in terms of how we're going to get through where we're going as a global population of humans.
Mm-hmm. let's go back to the actual tuna, because you said some remarkable things about the tuna that I think people don't know. Step me through the life cycle of a tuna. Where does he get conceived? Where does he get born?
Well, that's a good question. I think glad you brought that up. But everything's sort of interconnected. Basically, in the land of Canada, when the tuna come up there, they come to fatten up. Because the herring is a very oily fish. And they need that. They need to get on so much fat onto themselves so that it allows them to spawn as part of their sort of like cycle. And what they do is once they're fattened up in the fall in the land of Canada and Newfoundland, they migrate south and they go thousands of miles south and they end up in the Gulf of Mexico. Because in the Gulf of Mexico, there's certain currents that are off Louisiana that they spawn they lay their eggs in. And it has to be a certain kind of current, and I think the eggs are anywhere from like 15 feet down to the surface, and that's where they they hatch and sort of have their sort of small life there. But I mean that's another thing, sort of like I don't know if you remember when the BP Horizon blew up. But when that thing blew up, it blew up exactly where the tuna spawned in the Gulf of Mexico. When you think they're not already having a hard time in terms of getting something to eat, well, this thing blew up in the Gulf of Mexico when they were spawning in exactly where they were.
And that's the only known spawning ground, somebody said.
Oh, well, there's some debate. There's another one out, further offshore. But it's called the something slope. I forget the name of it. But that's kind of something new, but who knows, right? I mean, like I said, a lot of the science is really uncertain. But what happened was that Barbara Block, who's out of Monterey, Museum of Hopkins, Stanford Institute, is like one of the foremost, researchers in tuna fish. They were actually, gathering data in terms of. I think the idea was to do like a class action lawsuit against BP in terms of what they actually did to the region through oil. I don't know if that court case actually went through, but anyway, what ended up happening, I think it actually took out a number of mature tuna. They're not actually sure how many died. I mean, when I was up in North Lake in PEI in the fall, we actually had fish that had swam all the way back, and we were finding it with green meat inside. We were finding tuna that when you opened it up, there was like black sludge. I mean, they've obviously been consuming this stuff. But then the last couple of years in my research, I actually found out that there has been a big penalty. So what's happened is that after they spawned in the Gulf of Mexico, the small fish, when they develop into from the egg into a smaller fish, they're examining and they're finding that all the offspring all have, or many of them anyway, have heart defects, which they figure has been genetically altered because of the oil. So they figure when these fish get to like spawning age, they're just not going to live as long as they would need to in terms of being a part of that larger year class, which would ensure the future populations. Like nature's fantastic. It always has like 5 or 7 year classes of spawning fish, normally like cod and tuna, because if you have 1 year where things go bad, then you got kind of like this reserve safety. It's kind of like safety net in terms of the species. So more and more we're doing things to sort of disrupt the whole sort of natural cycle.
So they're born there. If they survive the oil industry in the Gulf of Mexico, do they stick around in the Gulf of Mexico for some time? You're starting out with something like this.
Yeah, they do.
Like
the small and basically the juvenile fish move out of there eventually and move up the coast. That would be like North Carolina, around start Florida. They go up to New England. And a lot of the fish at that point are juveniles, which are smaller fish. They're anywhere up to 30 pounds, 40 pounds in that range. And that's another big problem is that before they even get to Atlantic Canada, they have to go through 50,000 recreational fishermen with people really fancy boats, people can afford it, kind of like the 1% are out there sort of and there's not really any enforcement of regulations. There's just too many boats. and people are taking a lot of fish. So yeah, a lot of the juveniles are not making it up, and the fish that are lucky to make it up, you're chased down. People have, you see them on depth finders. I mean, it's not fun being a tuna these days, and I'm just and like I said, it would be a shame to lose these fish. But like I said, I'm very concerned about what's happening because we basically annihilated the food source at this point because we're using it for lobster bait, which is kind of crazy because the last few years we've had bumper prices for lobster. I mean, some boats are making $500,000 to $600,000 a boat. That's like 6 weeks work, and then you do your traps in the wintertime or whatever. Then you draw unemployment for the rest of the year. I mean, it's just it's a really good living, but why not see if you can find some bait from another part of the world where perhaps the bait stocks aren't in trouble as much, and give those stocks a chance to revive because but people if you make $600,000 in a year, it costs you $15,000 to buy bait, but you don't want to spend that they're too cheap to buy the $15,000 worth of bait. No, that's just more money for you, free bait, but at what cost for the future? There's no investment, in terms of leave those alone, the herring stocks to come back, and you can say the same thing about bluefin tuna, which represents less than 1% of their income. And these are endangered fish. I mean, it's so crazy in Canada that the unemployment insurance system, for example, not people know, is actually tied to an endangered species here, because the way that the fishing, when you get unemployment in the fishery, it doesn't work where normally we would need 22 weeks to get unemployment. There, it's a cash threshold of like $13,000, or at least it was. Like a fisherman would have to earn $13,000, and then they would get their stamps for the rest of the year. But if you're out fishing lobster and you're like a deckhand or first mate or whatever, and you only make $10,000, that one tag for the tuna at the end of the year is the money that you need to make up for that threshold to get your unemployment stamps for the rest of the year. So now you got the Canadian unemployment system tied into supporting and depleting an endangered species.
That's crazy. That's
really crazy.
Yeah,
there's a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, you go out there, you're fishing with what they call J hooks in the commercial fishery. They don't have to use circle hooks, which are far less dangerous for the fish. Circle hooks are something they got it from fishing marlin and sailfish down south. You swallow the fish as a tuna, and it goes into their stomach, and then basically the line will pull out because it doesn't catch anywhere. And the circle hooks are designed to catch right here, right? But with J hooks, they can catch anywhere. And as you know, these are really powerful fish, and they break off the line all the time. So you could actually, kill 4 fish out fishing, breaking it off until you finally get one in. But meanwhile, those other 4 fish, you've ripped the guts out of them.
Well, and that whole catch and release thing, is that really, doesn't that do enough damage to the fish that he's going to have a hard time to survive even if he...
Well, the fishermen, the catch and release charter guys, they totally want to see the fish survive, and that's why they're using circle hooks. But what I'm saying is that the commercial fishery using J hooks, they should actually change the regulations so that they use circle hooks, so you don't kill as many fish to get your one fish. But with charter fishing, no, they've been very responsible that way in terms of the types of hooks they're using. And part of the problem with the charter fishing, and you keep on improving it all the time, is that it's when you bring the fish in close to the boat. It's all these guys want to take pictures and hold the fish's mouth open. I don't know, whatever, just do this sort of King Kong thing. We conquered a 1,000-pound fish. They want to take those pictures, But when the fish is exhausted, these fish fight really hard. They fight so hard, in fact, that they actually will boil their own flesh. They'll actually cook their own flesh, and that's why you swim a tuna after after you catch one in the commercial fishery to cool the flesh down, because if the fish is boiled, it's not worth anything, you know, in terms of per pound or whatever. So these fish are really in a precarious state when they're close to the boat. And they're also ram ventilators in the sense that they're like sharks. You always have to have like water going through their mouths in terms of providing oxygen. But you have to slow the, you know, you're slowing the boat down, and you're holding, you know, like 170-pound line, you know, like there, and then the guy's taking pictures. So, you know, but they always seem to want too many pictures, and the fish is, you know, it's at a life and death situation, you know, and I've seen a lot of fish that release and just go like flat straight down to the bottom, and it's a sad thing to see. I mean, they have done sort of mortality rate studies, which were controlled studies, but people knew what they were doing. I think it was like 3.4% out of 50 fish, 2 fish actually died in terms of the tags that popped off them, right? But the actual numbers are higher. I'm quite certain of that, because in terms of a lot of people don't know how to handle a fish. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. You know, who knows what goes on in the water. When you're fishing, it's just the same as in a film. You know, you can snap off 3 fish. I mean, next thing you know, you got 3 fish. Before you got your picture, 3 fish are running around with, you know, 100 yards, 200 yards of line training behind them. You know, the line slaps the back of the fish, eventually cuts the flesh, it gets infected, and the fish dies. You know, so it's not exactly as clean a fishery as you would think in terms of hook and release. There's a lot of problems. There's been improvements. The fisherman now off of Surrey, this guy called Kenny McCrae, he came up with this really great invention. And these guys are really innovative. Like, fishermen are really smart guys, you know, and they can do some great things. Anyway, one of the great things they did was to develop what they call a swimming hook, which is like a gaff. It has the rope attached to this end, which is attached to the boat, which they drag the fish with. But they also have another rope, which is attached right where the loop is here, in terms of the gaff. So what they do is when they get the fish in alongside, they actually put a gaff through its mouth. And it's like less sensitive here in terms of catching it. You know, it's not a fun thing to have this through your mouth, but there is a lot of less. I know there's less nerves in that part of the mouth. But what it does is when instead of holding the line now, you hold the rope, and the guy who's at the captain can pull the accelerator down so they get more water going through the fish's mouth than you could hold the line, because it's impossible. You can only hold the line at a certain speed in terms of knottage, right? So what happens is that you hold the rope, and the fish gets a lot more water going through it. It starts picking up more oxygen, and I've seen it. I've been out there, I filmed it, and I've saw the fish. They actually drops in behind the boat, and so instead of lying on its side, the fish actually rights itself, and then drops down 10 or 15 feet, and then you see the tail starting to go, and that's a really good sign. And the way that this works in terms of the 2 ropes, when you pull the right rope, it grabs it right here where the hook was, and instant releases it, and the fish takes off in a really healthy state. So these are improvements that they're making, you know. So I mean, these guys, the last thing they want to do is like kill every tuna. They don't want that, you know. But they're trying to reduce the mortality. They see the fact that hook and release is very, very lucrative, because these guys stay in hotels, you know, the restaurants, and the hook and release is definitely better than killing them. But then you got to look at, well, the mortality is actually higher, you know, than what they've actually said in terms of that. So, and it's also additional pressure on top of the commercial fishery. So Carl Safina's point in my film was, well, if we didn't have charter fishing, then, you know, you wouldn't have that extra pressure on the stock. You just take your quota, but you're not actually adding to the mortality on top of the mortality of the commercial fishery. So you're saying you're better off just taking what you got, you know, and taking that out of the population if you really want to rebuild your stock. So
yeah, rather than releasing.
Well, that's what his argument is, and that's what the commercial fishermen say. It's funny that the commercial fishermen actually more closely aligned with Carl Safina, who's like probably the most outspoken ocean ecologists in a way. They're kind of like, for different reasons, are actually on the same side. And the charter fishery and the commercial fishery are at odds with each other because, you know, when you catch a fish and you battle it, I mean, you can, you know, like I said, you can boil the flesh, you can scar the fish up. You know what I mean? There can be like some problems. So the commercial guys just want to get a fish and get it in as healthy condition as they can, so that they'll get like a higher price per pound for it. But you know, part of the problem is that the fish that they're pulling out, because there's no herring, basically they fished out the herring for lobster bait. The fish are in poor condition generally. I mean, and the fish are really skinny because they're not getting enough to eat. For example, in 2016, and this was brought up in the legislature yesterday, as a matter of fact, the fishermen that caught the largest tuna, the fish was 1,080 pounds, and I actually had spoken to him and said, well, you must be thrilled, you know, you won the Premier's Cup. That's every fisherman's dream, to catch the biggest fish and be recognized by the Premier of the province with a trophy. And he said, well, I'm not really that happy. And I said, well, why aren't you happy? Wouldn't you be happy? And he said, no, actually. He said, it was a strange fish. You know, we got the fish, we pulled it up onto the wharf, and it had a great big head. And it had a really skinny body. It was abnormal looking. And as a result, we only got $1.25 a pound for our fish. And as a matter of fact, I owe money on the airfare to Japan because it didn't even pay for its airfare. I actually owe money on this fish. I mean, so it's a really good indicator of what the hell's going on out there. It's like that fish should be like, you know, it was 1,100 pounds. It could have been 1,300, even over 1,300 pounds if it had enough fat on it. So, but here we are with a fish that's in pathetic condition, celebrating taking one of the most important spawners out of the population, and giving the Premier giving a fisherman a trophy for catching the biggest pathetic spawner. I mean, it's just like outrageous, really. And it really just shows you like how far removed we are from understanding what this problem is. And to keep that going, you know, I think that should be a real signal. We need to do a study. It's not business as usual anymore out in the ocean. Things have changed. Everything's changed a lot since the 1960s in terms of where the fish distribution is, in terms of the food chain, in terms of how many fish are left. You know what I mean? Like, there's been a lot of devastation. In fact, I think Boris Worm at Dalhousie did this paper, and they said basically by 2048, everything's going to be gone in the rates that we're doing, according to that he's been charting. So, you know, you have to be proactive in the fishery. You can never be reactive, because if you're reactive, it's too late. And that's exactly what happened with the cod. You think the cod fishery would have been something that would have been like a gong bell, you know, the biggest gong fishing bell of all time in terms of bell ringer, wake up, you know. So we got that. That was given to us, and it woke us up. You know, there's like thousands of communities in Newfoundland all over the place. It's shut down. It changed. The only thing that kept Newfoundland going is the oil, not the cod fishery. You know what I mean? So here we go. We've learned that lesson. We've taken out all those year costs, and here we go again.
Though. We haven't learned that lesson. I mean,
well, that's what I'm saying. We haven't learned that lesson. You know, right. I mean, we have learned the lesson that we haven't learned that lesson. Is what I meant.
You know, one of the things that astonishes me about the cod fishery is if a catastrophe like that had occurred anywhere else in the country, and the number of jobs in proportion to population had been lost anywhere else in the country.
There's 20,000 inshore fishermen.
At least.
In Newfoundland.
Yeah.
800 people in the offshore factory freezer trawlers. 800 took 20,000 down. Yeah.
Now, did we ever have a royal commission about that? Did we ever have public hearings about that?
Well,
did we ever look at that?
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, I was over in Newfoundland when just after the Bay of Bulls, when Crosby, they're pounding the doors down trying to get in, and they said, no, there's going to be a moratorium. I was actually in Newfoundland filming then, because I sensed there was a big story. So I actually went and did sort of this guerrilla thing, and I went to DFO, and I didn't talk to the communications person. I just walked right into the building and started like talking, took my tape recorder in and interviewed people and fishermen, and I talked to all the different players. Richard Cashin at the time, who was in a very precarious position because he was the head of the union, represented the inshore fishermen and the offshore fishermen, which is kind of ridiculous because they're diametrically opposed. You know, how can you be, you know, the head of the union represent two forces that are actually, you know, completely irreconcilable in terms of what is needed, you know? So that was kind of like the problem as well. But anyway, so yeah, basically, Tobin was the premier back then, and they got together with I think it was Father McGrath. He was on the board of FPI, which is like which was the, you know, FPI was Fisheries Products International, which is the part of the large factory freezers that caused the problem, and helped annihilate the stock. So you had these kind of different political issues, but at the end of it, what they did in terms of to wash their hands of the reason there wasn't any Royal Commission, like you mentioned, it basically said, well, the reason it collapsed was because of the foreign overfishing. And they really pressed that. So every person that was involved in terms of why it collapsed, they all got together and said, we can't take the blame. We need to get together. And they actually formed a group called Sonar. I think that was the name of it. I can't remember the acronym means or whatever. And they said, we need to do a public relations job. And they did. They had Tobin go down to New York City, and they took one of the big fishing nets and they hung it up on a crane and made a big public spectacle to send the message out in the world that it was the foreign overfishing that caused the cod to collapse in Atlantic Canada. When the truth is, it was them. They're the ones that caused the collapse. It was the Canadians that did it. I mean, it didn't help that you had only 20% was foreign overfishing. But it's the same thing with the tuna. You know, the fishermen fought the RCMP to save the herring, you know, so they created like a bit of a sanctuary for them. And what did they do with it? When we had the 200-mile limit, what did we do with it? I mean, and that's, I mean, I think the history of what we've done is really the future in terms of policy, and we really have to go back and look what's happened and really mark this down and have a serious conversation about it in terms of how to develop a more responsible, sustainable policy for the future.
Yes, and be frank about what actually happened in the past, you know?
To be honest, yeah, you know, as far as the world knows, it was foreign overfishing that took all the cod off of Newfoundland. That's still the message. Actually, there needs to be a documentary on that because the truth has never come out. And it never came out.
And in a sense, it doesn't even matter. It was human overfishing, Canadian and foreign. And,
yeah, it was human overfishing in the sense, but it also has something to do with the way that fisheries are managed, because the Minister of Fisheries, who was Crosby at the time, has absolute power in terms of what happens with the fishery.
Yeah.
And I think of all the different politicians or ministers, he has like probably more power over his portfolio than any other minister in the federal government.
And he can completely disregard the science, which is actually against the law in places like Australia.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think we really need to change what the minister's power is in terms of managing based on science. So the science that they're basing it now is science that they get from DFO, which they are in control of. Yeah. So in terms of they don't like the numbers or the information they don't have to use it. And they can do. There was actually just a recommendation for the ban of bluefin tuna fishing in Canada, made by Canada's top ocean ecologists. Like I think there were 17 of them. There was only one that abstained from the vote. But it was unanimous that they got to stop fishing these fish now and allow these large breeders to help reproduce. You know, and they ignored it. It was like on his plate for like 6 years. It was just too long anyway. And if he was in trouble, why take 6 years to make a decision? That's even harmful in itself in terms of the time. But yeah, so they basically, if you look at the document, the reasons why that they didn't ban tuna in Canada, it's like it wasn't to do with the science or so much to do with the actual numbers of the fish, and in terms of there's some kind of threat to the fish because the stocks are definitely down. The reason that they didn't want to ban because it would have too much of a sociological impact on fishing communities. That's one of the main reasons. And if we didn't catch them, someone else would. If we didn't take our quota, ICAT would give it to somebody else. So what's the sense of banning tuna in Canada? So that's the logic. So I think in terms of the future, you know, in terms of changing the minister's powers, I definitely think there needs to be something done there. But in the old days in Canada, the way that they used to manage scientific decisions in terms of species at risk and stuff like that, it was the independent scientists that would make the recommendation. You know what I mean? And the minister would be obligated under our laws to kind of listen to the broader knowledge of science in terms of what to do. But now it's been narrowed down to like just a couple of scientists under their complete control. So I think in terms of managing the future, I think what we really have to do is go back to that system that we had and start making the whole decision process much more democratic, based on real science, based on the best science that we have in terms of making our decisions moving forward. So I think there's things in the legislation that we can do to tackle some of these problems, and I think it's systemic. I mean, it's part of that. Part is like the way, like I said, we were socialized. With tuna particularly, that, you know, these fish are food. Like, we just don't really see them the same way we would see an orca or a dolphin. You know, even though they are just as, you know, epic as those creatures.
Yeah, and your film really shows that.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to show the fish. You know, it took me many, many years to figure out, you know, how they're so big and so fast, they just go like that, and you get no sense of them, you know. And I just said, well, I was watching a Vimeo movie on surfing, and I saw the way the guy did the surfing, photographed it, and it was just under the water. And the technology changed as well, so I was able to buy my own camera that could do super high speed, slow motion. Before, those cameras were super expensive, so the technology helped me in terms of being able to be able to buy the camera to do it myself with my poor filmmakers, like, you know, income. I could actually get one, and between that and I just had this eureka moment when I saw the surfing video, and finally figured out how to do it. And so we got Chris Ball, who's a great cinematographer here from Nova Scotia, a good friend of mine. And I said, Chris, I come up with this way. I think we can get this, you know. And he said, and he was keen. He's an adventure kind of a guy, and he loves like jumping in with giant tuna. And I'm aboard. So we actually, it was the very last shoot that we had after 5 years of filming. And at that point, the film board actually didn't want to support us going out and doing that shoot, because they said, well, just wait until we get to the get our rough cut, and then we'll decide whether we need it or not. They didn't want to put the money out for it because they've understandably spent a lot of money. So I can understand how they were feeling about that. But the thing is that fish do not work on our cycles. They work on natural cycles. So if he had gone and waited till we got the rough cut, the fish would be in Florida by then. So I just had to make the decision to go out and get it. So Chris and I went out, and
the accountants didn't love you.
What's that?
The accountants did not love you.
No, actually I financed this myself in terms of, you know, being able to trade footage with the fishermen, which is actually what I'm doing on now, working on now. You know, and that kind of, the guy, I got really lucky because I ran into this doctor from Portland, Dr. Stuart Exhall, who comes out, he fishes all over the world. He's very wealthy, surgeon's retired, and fishes yellowfin in the South Pacific. I mean, he goes to Australia after marlin. There's guys that are out there, that's all they do, like year round pretty much. Anyway, so I talked to the fisherman that owned the boat, and he said, yeah, so no, I don't think we can get you on the boat because we got 4 guys, there won't be enough room for your camera. And I said, darn, you know, because I thought there was a good chance of going. And divine providence happened. There was a hurricane heading up to Atlantic Canada coming from the south. And I go, you know, at first I didn't know it was divine providence. I just was saying, oh no, not only can I not get on the boat, but there's a hurricane coming, which is gonna, you won't be able to get on the water, be too rough, and the fish will scatter or whatever. But luckily enough, the hurricane decided to take a right-hand turn towards Europe, and 3 of the guys canceled on the boat, so it made room. And then all of a sudden I got a phone call, oh, by the way, yeah, bring your camera, bring your diver, we got room on the boat. And with Dr. Stuart Exhall, I said, yeah, I don't mind you filming on the boat, it'd be great, you know. And so he invited us on the boat, and we went out at night at 3 in the morning, drove like 50 miles out to sea. And it was a very special day, very special, because of the crazy weather, you know, with the hurricane. it just caused the water to calm right down. And you hardly ever seen it. It was just like molten mercury, soft waves, just
Yeah,
this
there's a
kind
number
of
of
dark
shots in
water, kind of dark water, because that kind of atmospheric thing would happen. The sun was coming up over the horizon, and we didn't even know where the fish would turn up. And it was just sort of like, I feel in some way like the tuna gods wanted me to make this film. You know?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, so the tuna turned up, and there they were, and the sun was just coming up over the horizon. So we had Chris in the water with the camera, the high-speed slow motion camera, and I was leaning over the boat. So we played this kind of tag team thing where, you know, if the fish was under the water, I handed the camera, and the camera's like shooting, buzzing with so many frames, you know, anyway, hand it down to him, and he'd film one under the water. And if one was near the surface, he'd pass me the camera, and I'd film it so you could get, you know, turning over. Of course, we were flipping it out for a single herring. We should never even got them. Part of the tragedy of the beautiful images we got, we should never have got them. Those fish should never have been even close. And the only reason they're coming up and we got the shots we did is because they're starving. The same reason is that they're so easy to catch for the charter fishery. The images I got in my film is part of the tragedy of what's happening with it, and which is really ironic considering the absolute beauty of what you see in those images. You know, so it's really meaningful in a number of ways that is not exactly evident when you see the film. But anyway, so the fish would, you know, turn over on the herring, and in super slow motion, its dorsal would come up, and it'd be all like glass being pulled off in slow motion, and it'd be all backlit by the sun coming up just under over the horizon, with crazy hurricane clouds everywhere, with molten sort of water, and it made these epic images. And it really made the film because it finally, you know, we were able to. These images that are in Bluefin are not in any other doc ever made. I mean, it really are. It really is something new that people have never seen before, and I think it did a couple of things. One, it really showed you the fish and the epic quality of the art, to finally see them as an epic creature rather than sushi on your plate. You know, that really made people think. Well, a lot of people when they come to the film say, well, I'm not going to eat sushi or sashimi again, because I mean, I see what they are. You know, and I made a film which is not didactic. You know, I mean, I love fishermen. I want fishermen to make money and the communities to do well, you know, but I think it has to be done in some kind of sensible way where you actually allow the stocks to reproduce. Let's talk about the truth of what's happening with the herring. Let's talk about the truth of what's happening to it. Let's talk about the truth in terms of the science being uncertain. You know, what are we doing? You know, I mean, at some point we're sort of like, do we have to wait till they collapse like the cod, and then the truth comes out, or doesn't? In the case of the cod in Newfoundland, the truth never comes out. You know, so I think that's what the role of filmmakers are in a way, is where in society where you have your scientists and your government, they take care of the management, and the fishermen fish here, you know, the rest of us are doing everything else on land. In a way, I think a filmmaker's great because they're kind of like a society floater. They're able to take their camera and sort of transcend all the normal structures in terms of how humans organize themselves to actually get observe and see a picture, see the forest or the trees, in this case, see the tuna through the waves.
Let me take you back to the tuna themselves too, because again, we had, you know, you're right, we don't appreciate them for the magnificent wild animals that they are, and the film certainly does show that. But the essence of this situation is the tuna came back because they were starved, they couldn't get food elsewhere. But they actually can't get it here either, right? That's why they're coming up to your boat, because you can give them a herring or two. But that body, a stock of herring that they've come to rely on. First question is, so we've then got a temporary situation, and we're now seeing that, right? That they're no longer coming back in the same way that they were even 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, I mean, basically they've exhausted the herring schools. And we saw that coming and making the film. And it's kind of crazy. They know it's the basis of the food chain. They fought the RCMP to save them. But to continue to fish them while they're spawning, not even allowing them to spawn, I mean, you're really throwing dice at the devil. And you're throwing your own future into a very risky situation. But it's sort of like they know it, they can see it, but they can't stop it. And why is that? You know, and it's sort of like, Well, there's a code, you know, and fishermen are noble people. I mean, I think fishermen are, you know, are super smart. I mean, they're out in the boat all the time. They're thinkers. They're constantly thinking, and I have total respect for them in that way, in that regard. But I mean, it's sort of like if you were a herring fishing person. Well, you know, maybe that's where you get most of your income, but you do not want to tread on someone else's business.
Yeah,
in that sense, and if you do, you start complaining. When you go out and catch a lobster in the spring, you get your lines cut. Mm-hmm. So there's retribution in fishing, and you can get in trouble. I mean, it can be a rough thing. You know, fishermen don't mess around. You know, they're very. I mean, you have to sort of fight for your territory. A lot of it's inherited through family. You know. So, you know, there's certain codes there, and I think that's part of the culture, which is part of the problem. And it's sort of like I said, everyone thinks catching the large tuna is fine when they're the biggest spawners, but the truth is catching the large tuna is the worst thing you can do. And you don't even need to catch them at all. Basically, if 1% of their income is basically just a year-end bonus at best, you know what I mean? And you know, really, it's not about money. You talk to fishermen, no one's making money tuna fishing. It's really about the photo op, you know? And it's sort of like the ultimate affirmation of who you are as a hunter-gatherer. It's like a very powerful theme. It's identity. It's in terms of affirmation of, I forget the right word used, but of you before your family and before your community in the ultimate expression of a fisherman, which is to be caught in a beautiful photograph with a beautiful fish with your beautiful family. So there's some things, like fishing tuna, it's like buck fever. There's a certain irrational quality about it. You say, well, no, you can't stop fishing tuna. They go absolutely nuts. They get emotionally, it goes like spills over the top. Anger, you know, God knows, you know. It's nothing to do with the year-end bonus. They've already made all this money off of lobster fishing, but it's about something more important to them in terms of their emotions, in terms of how they feel their place in the world, and it's their pride, and and you know, when you get pride sort of crossing swords with what makes sense in terms of reproduction of the tuna, there's a problem there too. It's about pride in terms of the premier giving you a large trophy for catching the largest spawner. I mean, these are like kind of like sociological issues that we need to straighten out as a society.
So the issue is not in the ocean. The issue is between our...
That's it. That's what I've been learning. That's why my doc, Bluefin, has been doing so well in a sense, because it's sort of giving a sense of that in terms of there's a larger discussion needs to happen in terms of tuning ourselves as human beings within our own society. And if we do that well, then we will have the tools in terms of being able to do really much more productive things in terms of conservation of species and being sure that, you know, we have healthy fisheries so that it would support generations in the future. But we really haven't done the work in our minds in terms of who we are as a species and how we react and what our expectations are and what are the most important things for us to be able to see clearly for a path forward. And I think that's why we need these kinds of conversations, like the kind of stuff that you're doing, a lot of the people that you talk to for this series and things like that. And I think that's valuable, you know, and what you're doing is valuable. I'm able to contribute something to help with that process, and sense that you're, you know, a lot of people are doing work in the forest or they're doing different areas and we're collecting information. And I think, you know, gradually, you know, that, you know, with a lot of, my view is in terms of, you know, people go, well, you can't do anything about it. It's like impossible, you know. But I think if enough people are involved, there's sort of like a positive energy, I think, that wins in the end. No, love, no. But I just, you know what I mean? I think altogether, if we just keep on working and don't let off the gas, always be vigilant. It's like the arts, you know. Like my mom always said, you know, let off the gas, you'll lose it. And you got to keep the constant pressure in there, because those other forces will drive it down. So there is kind of a push-pull effect, and you just got to stay vigilant. I think the people that you know, that really care, you know, that, like, why are you here in the first place? I mean, that's a question all humans should ask themselves. Why are you here? What are you doing here? What should be the point of your life? What would be the best thing you could do with your life? I mean, is it the American dream? Is that really what we need to pursue in terms of the John Locke view of the world? You know, or is it? Are you here for a bigger purpose, or do you want to leave the world a better place than when you arrived?
And you do.
Well, I do, you know, in a sense, yeah, in that sense. But I mean, to be honest with you, it's like I'm just the same. I mean, I'm a filmmaker, and through the experience of making the film, it's really a way of training me to sort of see the world a little bit differently or understand it differently, and to share that with people in terms of that experience. I think that's my role as a filmmaker. But
Terrific.
yeah, I think so. But I mean, just it's. You have to be kind of crazy, because I live on like next to nothing. My house is falling down, you know. I spend all my money on cameras. But you know, it's sort of like no. I mean, I think as people, as a society, really have to say, well, what's important? Well, my family's important. Well, if your family's important, your kids are important, your grandchildren's important, where are you going to leave them? Like I was saying with the DFO, with the problem in terms of the science, the minister, and all that stuff. Yeah, but another thing that's happening is that, so our stock assessment model is busted because they're so easy to catch. The fish are hungry. I mean, DFO is in complete denial. I was on the Current about that, and the fish are fat and fine. It's just complete nonsense. It's not. It's even the fishermen will tell you that's not true. But so, and then you have uncertainty in terms of the 59% of the tuna being here from the European origin. So that's not even been studied, you know. So basically what we need is a new stock assessment model, because the old one doesn't work because of the changes in the way that we're fishing. DFO is saying, no, it's the fishermen that have changed their behavior, meaning like we're just better fishermen and we're just catching more fish. Well, it's true in terms of the technology, but it's also because we're starving to death because they're taking all their food away for lobster bait, which is really where we're making our money, right? So what's happened is that, you know, with the conservative government cutting back on science, there's been a big attack on science by a lot of, like, you know, the 1% that are controlling government, which is like a huge problem. And science is a real threat, you know, because if somebody wants to do, like, exploit something, then you have to go through an environmental process. So all these people are attacking science and attacking environmental regulations and, you know, stuff like that. So what DFO has done is sort of like, well, we need to find a new way. So what they did was they came up with a new way of doing a stock assessment through acoustic sonar. And I was out and about with one of their scientists, and, you know, basically what you do is you tack back and forth, north and south, against the east-west longitude of the island, and through a number, basically it sends down a beam, and any tuna that swims through it's recorded on a computer which is inside the cabin, so they can actually do kind of a general assessment in terms of how much of the fish are in that particular area, and you can add it all up, whatever. I mean, but it's going to take 10 years to perfect that. But meanwhile, basically, we have no indices. There's no indices in terms of any kind of proper stock assessment available anymore, which is a really big question. And to go to ICAT and keep on saying, no, we got this many fish, give us this much quota. I mean, it's in complete chaos, basically. So, and the DFO knows that, you know, and basically ICAT, some of the scientists are saying, well, actually your stats are off, we're on to you. Don't use supercharged data to come back and try to get more quota from us, because we know what's going on. Anyway, so the solution is, you know, the solution they came up with, and it's absolutely insane. They went and got more quota, in addition to what they get from ICAT, from Mexico. And I'm going like, I was going like, how does Mexico figure into this? You know, it's like the unemployment insurance. There's like a lot of weird stuff that happens. Like, okay, Mexico. How's Mexico? Anyway, basically at the end of the season, which would be September 30th, you know, you either caught all your tags, and then after that, there's a few left over, somebody didn't catch, and then they put it back into a, you know, at the Fishermen's Association, there's a barrel with your name on it, your number, and you pull out, well, you get to catch an extra fish this year. Well, a lot of those tags that were in that barrel was what they call the Mexican quota. So basically what's happened is, in Mexico, you cannot catch tuna down, because that's where they're spawning, so they've actually banned catching tuna, bluefin tuna down there, but Mexico still gets the quota. So what they do is that Mexico talks to Canada, and they trade it to the Department of Trade for pork bellies or lumber or wheat. And then they go like, okay, well, what are we going to do with this quota? Well, give it to DFO. And DFO goes, well, that's worth money. We're going to sell it to all the fishermen. So they sell it to all the fishing associations through Atlantic Canada, and you get all this extra quota and extra pressure on the fish. And what's DFO? There's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. They're using that money to fund the acoustic sonar project in terms of a new stock assessment. So they're actually catching and supporting killing the last of what remains of the tuna to research a project and their salaries and how to save the tuna. This is how crazy, this is where we reached right now. And I believe that project DFL is doing is super important. I totally support it. But that money should not come from there. It should not come from selling tuna in Japan to support science in that way. That money should come from the federal government and give the Department of Fisheries the money they need so they don't have to, put extra pressure on the stock. I mean, these are just some of the things that there's a number of things that you can do to improve things, and I think that would be a very important one.
John Hopkins, writer and director of the internationally acclaimed documentary film Bluefin. Many of our shows have focused on the health of the oceans and their wildlife, including our own documentary film Salmon Wars. Alexandra Morton fights aquaculture on behalf of Pacific salmon. Daniel Pauly explains why large predatory fish like the tuna have largely disappeared. And Alana Mitchell explores the general crisis of the global ocean. We're going to be doing more interviews about what's happening in the oceans, partly because we ourselves live on the ocean and care deeply about it, but also because the oceans cover 2/3 of the planet's surface, and what happens in the oceans shapes all of life on Earth. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Kelly.